Here are 7 eerie and scary stories for you. As a traveling nurse, Ellen was used to moving from place to place, adapting quickly to new environments and making the best of whatever situation she found herself in. Her latest assignment brought her to Crestwood Hospital, an old, nearly forgotten institution on the outskirts of a small city. The hospital's age was evident in its faded walls, creaky floors, and flickering lights. The staff was sparse, but Ellen was assured it was manageable. She would be working the graveyard shift, a time she was familiar with, having worked many night shifts in her career. Week 1. On her first night, Ellen met her colleagues for the shift. It seemed like there were 4 of them working together: herself, another nurse named Margaret, a janitor named Bill, and a security guard named Frank. They exchanged pleasantries, and Ellen felt a strange sense of camaraderie despite the eerie atmosphere. As Ellen settled into her routine, she began to notice some odd occurrences. During her rounds, she would catch glimpses of Bill mopping the floors or pushing his janitorial cart down the hallways. He never spoke, but Ellen didn't think much of it. He was probably just a quiet, diligent worker. However, every time she tried to engage him in conversation, he would disappear around a corner or into a room. One night, as she was preparing to take a break, she saw Bill in the break room. She decided to strike up a conversation. "Hey Bill, how's it going?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Bill didn't respond. He continued to mop the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. Ellen felt a chill run down her spine but brushed it off, chalking it up to the late hour and her own fatigue. Later that night, she mentioned Bill to Margaret. "He's a bit of an odd one, isn't he?" Margaret looked at her, puzzled. "Who?" "Bill, the janitor," Ellen replied, trying to keep her tone light. Margaret's face paled. "There is no Bill on the night shift. It's just you, me, and Frank." Ellen laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Margaret's serious expression told her otherwise. That night, she decided to keep an eye out for Bill, but he never appeared again. Week 2. Ellen started her second week with a sense of unease. She had been regularly checking on a patient in room 302 at the end of the hallway. The patient never spoke, only hummed, and stared out the window. Ellen found it odd, but thought perhaps it was just one of the many peculiarities she would have to get used to at Crestwood. One night, as she was doing her rounds, Margaret asked her where she was headed. "Room 302, Ellen replied. Margaret's face went pale. "That room's been empty for years. We don't have a patient in there." Ellen's blood ran cold. She had been checking on that patient for days. Deciding to see for herself, she walked to room 302, opened the door, and found it completely empty. The bed was made, untouched, and the room smelled of dust and neglect. She could still hear the faint humming in her mind. Confused and frightened, Ellen decided to check the hospital records. She found an old logbook in the nurse's station that listed all the current patients. Room 302 was indeed marked as vacant. Her hands trembling, she flipped back through the pages, trying to find any record of the patient she had been tending to. There was nothing. Feeling a mix of fear and determination, Ellen approached Frank, the security guard, during his rounds. "Frank, have you ever seen anyone in room 302? Frank looked at her with a serious expression. "No one's been in that room for years. Why do you ask?" Ellen hesitated before explaining what she had experienced. Frank listened, his face growing more troubled with each word. "You're not the first nurse to say something like that," he finally said, "but it's best not to dwell on it. This place has its stories." Ellen nodded, but the unease lingered. She decided to be more cautious, but the memory of the humming patient stayed with her, a constant reminder of the hospital's unsettling atmosphere. Week 3. Ellen tried to shake off the unsettling experiences as she started her third week. She told herself that old buildings had their quirks, and her imagination was just running wild. One night, she took the elevator to bring supplies to the ER. As she descended, the elevator suddenly stopped at the basement level, where the morgue was located. The doors opened with a ding, but the corridor was dark and empty. Ellen pressed the button to close the doors, but before they could shut, she felt a sudden chill. The air grew icy, and it felt as though someone had stepped into the elevator with her. She couldn't see anyone, but she felt their presence. The doors finally closed, and the elevator resumed its ascent. Ellen stood frozen, clutching the cart of supplies, her breath visible in the cold air. By the time she reached the ER, the temperature had returned to normal, and the unsettling feeling had passed. Later that night, Ellen mentioned the incident to Frank. "Do you ever feel like someone's in the elevator with you?" Frank looked at her, his expression grim. "The basement's always been creepy. I avoid it whenever I can." "You should too." Ellen nodded, but the fear lingered. She couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, even when she was alone. The hospital's dark corridors and flickering lights only added to her growing sense of dread. Week 4. The fourth week brought more questions than answers. Ellen was working in the ER when the security guard Frank approached her during a lull in activity. "Hey, Ellen, who were you talking to earlier?" he asked, his expression serious. Confused, Ellen replied, "What do you mean? I haven't talked to anyone all night except the patients." Frank looked troubled. "I saw you on the CCTV talking to someone, but there was no one there." Ellen's heart skipped a beat. She remembered feeling like she wasn't alone, but she had brushed it off as her imagination. Seeing the worry in Frank's eyes, she decided not to mention it again. She didn't want to seem paranoid, even though every fiber of her being told her something was very wrong. That night, she reviewed the CCTV footage with Frank. There she was, standing in the hallway, talking and gesturing as if she were having a conversation. But the hallway was empty, save for her. Ellen felt a shiver run down her spine as she watched herself interacting with thin air. "Maybe I was just tired," she said weakly, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. Frank shook his head. "You're not the first one to experience things like this. Just be careful, okay?" Ellen nodded, but the sense of unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and the whispers and hummings seemed to follow her wherever she went. Week 5. By the 5th week, Ellen was exhausted and on edge. The sleepless nights and eerie experiences were taking their toll. One night, she decided to take a nap in the nurses' quarters, hoping for a moment of peace. As soon as she lay down, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Her body froze, and she found herself unable to move. She had experienced sleep paralysis before, but this time, it was different. As she lay there, unable to move or cry out, she saw the door to the quarters slowly creak open. An eerie figure, a patient with a hospital gown, shuffled towards her. The figure's movements were unnatural, jerky, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The patient's eyes were hollow, and their mouth hung open in a silent scream. Ellen wanted to scream, but she was trapped in her own body. The figure came closer and closer, its lifeless eyes staring into Ellen's. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very essence of fear was being poured into her soul. Just as the figure reached her, Ellen woke up, her body drenched in sweat. She looked around the empty room, her heart pounding. She knew it had been a dream, but it felt so real. That night, Ellen decided she couldn't take any more. She confronted Margaret, demanding to know what was going on. Margaret sighed and explained that the hospital had a long history of unexplained occurrences. Many staff members had reported seeing apparitions, hearing voices, and feeling cold spots. "We've all learned to live with it," Margaret said. "But if it's too much for you, no one would blame you for leaving." Ellen shook her head. She wasn't a quitter. She decided to stick it out, determined to see her assignment through. But the fear lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at Crestwood Hospital. Week 6. Ellen entered her 6th week at Crestwood with a mix of dread and determination. She was determined to see her assignment through, even if it meant enduring the unexplainable events that seemed to plague her nights. One evening, while making her rounds, she heard singing coming from the hallway. It was a soft, melodic tune, hauntingly beautiful yet deeply unsettling. She followed the sound, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. As she turned the corner, the singing abruptly stopped. The hallway was empty, the shadows deepening as the lights flickered overhead. Ellen called out, but no one answered. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her, before retreating back to the nurse's station. Week 7. By the 7th week, Ellen was barely sleeping. The constant feeling of being watched, the eerie sounds, and the unexplainable events had left her exhausted and on edge. One night, as she tried to rest in the nurse's quarters, she felt a presence beside her bed. She opened her eyes but saw nothing. Yet the feeling of someone standing there, watching her, was unmistakable. She could hear faint breathing, feel the coldness of their presence. She lay there, eyes wide open, until morning light filtered through the small window and the oppressive presence finally lifted. Week 8. Ellen's final week at Crestwood began with a sense of relief that her time there was almost over. On her last night, she found herself stuck in the elevator once again. This time, it felt more sinister. The elevator doors opened on the basement level, and the chill returned, more intense than before. Ellen stood there, paralyzed by fear as the doors remained open. She could hear whispers, indistinct and haunting, as if the spirits of the hospital were all around her. After what felt like an eternity, the doors closed and the elevator ascended. When Ellen finally reached the main floor, she was shaking, her nerves frayed. She knew she couldn't stay another minute in the hospital. As she stepped out of the elevator, she was called into the head nurse's office. The head nurse, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Jenkins, apologized to Ellen. "I'm sorry for what you've experienced here," she said, her voice low. "We're severely understaffed, and I ask that you don't mention any of this to the next traveling nurse. We need all the help we can get." Ellen nodded, too drained to argue. She packed her things and left Crestwood Hospital, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. She had survived 8 weeks in a place that seemed to straddle the line between the living and the dead. As she drove to her next assignment, Ellen reflected on her time at Crestwood. She had always been a skeptic, but her experiences there had shaken her beliefs. The hospital had a dark past, and she had become a part of its eerie history. She knew she would never forget the haunting faces and chilling whispers that had accompanied her through those long, lonely nights. Ellen realized that some places hold on to their pain and suffering, their history seeping into the present. Crestwood Hospital was one of those places, and she was grateful to leave it behind. But she knew that no matter where she went, the memories of those 8 weeks would stay with her. A reminder that the line between the living and the dead is often thinner than we think. My name is Ron. I lived a normal life until it all came crashing down. I was wrongfully accused and convicted of a crime I didn't commit. The evidence was circumstantial, but the jury was convinced, and now I'm here, in this hellish prison, trying to make sense of it all. To keep my sanity, I've decided to keep a diary. Maybe one day, when I'm out of here, I'll look back on this and realize it was just a bad dream. Diary entries. Day 1. Today was my first day in this prison. They assigned me to cell 13. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The number 13, a number associated with bad luck, seems to be my constant companion now. The cell is cold and damp, with walls covered in scratches and faded stains that tell tales of the suffering that's taken place here. As I lay on the hard cot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, and I had this eerie sensation of being watched. I hope I can get some sleep tonight. Day 2. Last night was rough. I barely got any sleep. Around midnight, I started hearing whispers. At first I thought it was the other inmates, but the voices seemed too close, too intimate. I turned on my side to try and ignore them, but the whispers only grew louder, almost pleading. I asked the guard about it this morning, but he just smirked and told me to get used to it. I'm beginning to wonder what kind of place this really is. Day 3. The whispers continued last night, and I could have sworn I heard someone calling my name. It sounded like a man's voice, deep and desperate. I couldn't take it anymore and shouted for it to stop, but the only response I got was a chill that ran down my spine. I tried talking to some of the other inmates during our yard time, but when I mentioned cell 13, they just looked at me with pity and walked away. One of them, an older guy named Frank, whispered, "Just try to survive, kid." What the hell is happening here? Day 4. Tonight was the worst yet. I was jolted awake by the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw a man. He looked like he was from another time. Old-fashioned clothes, gaunt face, hollow eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with this intense, sorrowful look. I blinked, and he was gone. I know what I saw. I'm not crazy. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the cell sending waves of fear through me. Day 5. The man was back last night. This time, he whispered to me. His voice was raspy, filled with a kind of urgency that made my blood run cold. He said, "Leave. You must leave before it's too late." I asked him why, but he just shook his head and disappeared. I tried to talk to the guards about it this morning, but they just laughed it off, saying I was losing my mind. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Day 6. I had another visitor last night. This time, it was a young man, barely out of his teens. He looked terrified, his eyes wide with fear. He kept repeating, "He's coming, he's coming." I tried to ask him who, but he just vanished, leaving me with more questions than answers. I spent the rest of the night pacing my cell, trying to make sense of it all. There's something terribly wrong with this place, and I'm starting to think it's not just in my head. Day 7. The whispers are constant now, a background noise that I can't escape. They're no longer just voices. I can hear sobbing, screaming, and the sounds of pain and suffering. The young man appeared again, this time covered in bruises. He told me he was beaten to death by the guards, and his eyes were hollow, lifeless. I can't get his face out of my mind. I don't know how many more ghosts are out there, but each one brings a new layer of horror. Day 8. Last night I met an older man. He said he was framed too, just like me. He told me he never got out, that this place killed him. He warned me about the others, said they wouldn't stop until I joined them. His eyes were filled with a sadness that I can't describe. I'm starting to believe him. This place is cursed, and I'm trapped in it. Day 9. I tried to talk to the guards again today, but they're no help. They laugh at me, call me crazy. I don't know how to make them understand. I'm not the only one who's seen these ghosts. I can't be. Frank came by during yard time and told me to keep my head down, that talking about the ghosts would only make things worse. But how can I ignore something so real? Day 10. Another night, another ghost. This one was a middle-aged woman. She said she was here for a crime she didn't commit either. She cried the whole time, saying she missed her children. My heart breaks for her, for all of them. She told me to leave, to find a way out before it's too late. I don't know how I can, but I have to try. The desperation in her eyes haunts me even now. Day 11. The ghosts are getting more aggressive. They shout at me, scream for me to leave. They show me their wounds, their broken bodies. Last night, one of them grabbed my arm, and I could feel the cold, clammy grip, as if it were real. I can't close my eyes without seeing them. I'm so tired, but every time I try to sleep, they're there, waiting. Day 12. I found out more about the first prisoner of Cell 13. His name was Samuel Whitaker, and he was a serial killer back in the late 19th century. He was known as the Butcher of Cold Springs. He murdered over a dozen men and women, all of whom were confined in the same prison. They say he was driven by a sadistic need to inflict pain and suffering. When he was finally caught, he showed no remorse and laughed as he was sentenced to death. They hanged him in the prison courtyard, but his spirit never left. The other prisoners believe he's the one haunting Cell 13, driving everyone who stays there to madness or death. Day 13. I can't do this anymore. Samuel appeared to me last night. His eyes were cold, empty. He told me I would never leave, that I would die here like the others. He laughed as he said it, a sound that chilled me to the bone. I'm starting to think he's right. The ghosts are relentless, and I'm not sure how much more I can take. I can feel myself slipping. I'm so tired. Day 14. I tried to talk to the warden today. He didn't believe me. He said I was just trying to get out of my cell. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm losing my mind. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something real happening here. Something evil. I need to find a way out, but I don't know how. The walls are closing in on me. Day 15. Samuel showed me how he died. He laughed as he was hanged, said he'd be back. He said he'd make sure no one ever left this cell alive. I can feel his presence every night, watching me, waiting. The other ghosts are more desperate, more fearful. They beg me to leave, but I don't know how. I feel trapped, helpless. Day 16. I can't sleep. The whispers are too loud. The ghosts are too real. I feel like I'm being pulled into their world, like I'm losing touch with reality. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Every night is a new horror, and I don't know how much more I can take. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Day 17. I tried to hang myself last night. Samuel's voice was in my head, telling me to do it. The guards found me just in time. They laughed, said I was just another crazy inmate. They don't understand. No one does. I don't know how to make them see. I don't know how to escape this nightmare. I feel so alone. Day 18. I saw a new ghost last night. He was different. He told me to hold on, that the truth would come out. He said I would be free. I don't know if I can believe him, but it's the first hope I've had in a long time. His presence was calming, almost reassuring. I need to hold on to that hope, to believe that I can get out of here. Day 19. The guards told me I have a visitor tomorrow. My lawyer. He says he's found new evidence, that it proves I'm innocent. I want to believe him, but I'm so scared. What if it's not enough? What if I'm stuck here forever? I don't know if I can survive much longer. The ghosts are relentless, and I'm at my breaking point. Day 20. I'm free. The new evidence proved I was innocent. They let me go. I walked out of that cell and didn't look back. As I left, I heard Samuel's voice one last time, laughing, telling me I'd be back. I don't care. I'm out. I'm free. Epilogue. After getting out, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I needed to know more to understand why that cell was haunted. I started researching Samuel Whitaker and Cold Springs Prison. Samuel Whitaker was born in 1867 in Cold Springs, a small town with a dark history. He was a butcher by trade, but his passion was murder. He killed his victims with precision, leaving their bodies in gruesome displays. When he was finally caught in 1896, the town breathed a sigh of relief. He was hanged in the prison courtyard, but many believed his evil spirit remained. Cold Springs Prison was built in 1854, and from the beginning it had a reputation for cruelty and suffering. Over the years, many prisoners died within its walls, either from neglect, violence, or despair. Cell 13 was particularly notorious. Every inmate who stayed there either went mad or died under mysterious circumstances. The guards didn't care, and the warden ignored the whispers of haunting. I found accounts of other prisoners who had seen Samuel's ghost. They all described the same cold, empty eyes, the same cruel laugh. It was clear that Samuel's spirit was a powerful, malevolent force, driving others to madness and death. But there was something else. The first prisoner to die in Cell 13 was a man named John Parker. He was an innocent man, framed for a crime he didn't commit. The guards tortured him until he confessed, and he died in that cell, alone and terrified. Many believe his spirit was the first to haunt Cell 13, and Samuel's presence only made it worse. The more I learned, the more I understood that I was lucky to get out alive. Cold Springs Prison is a place of unimaginable suffering, a place where the walls themselves seem to hold the pain of the past. I still have nightmares, still hear the whispers, but I'm free. I survived, and now I can tell the world about the horrors of Cold Springs Prison. The Thompson house stood at the edge of Maplewood, a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a typical two-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a white picket fence. To the neighbors, the Thompson family seemed like any other, happy, ordinary. But tonight, 12-year-old Ethan Thompson was alone for the first time, and the house didn't feel ordinary at all. His parents had gone out for the evening, leaving him with a list of emergency contacts, a microwavable dinner, and a promise to be back by midnight. Ethan wasn't scared. He was excited. He had plans to watch horror movies and eat popcorn until he couldn't stay awake any longer. The evening began uneventfully. Ethan microwaved his dinner, settled on the couch, and flicked through the channels until he found a scary movie. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. As the movie played, Ethan found himself more engrossed in the plot, the flickering shadows on the screen mirroring the ones in the room. Around 9 o'clock, just as the movie reached its climax, Ethan heard a noise from upstairs. It was a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. He paused the movie, his heart beating a little faster. The house was old. It made noises all the time. He reassured himself it was nothing. Minutes passed, and Ethan returned to his movie. But then, the sound came again, this time louder, closer. It was followed by a faint, dragging noise, like something heavy being moved. Ethan muted the television, straining to hear. The noises continued, growing more distinct and unsettling. He swallowed hard, trying to convince himself it was just the house settling. Ethan decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept up the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Each step felt like an eternity, the wooden stairs creaking under his weight. He reached the top and paused, listening. The house was silent again. He walked down the hallway, passing his parents' bedroom and the guest room. When he reached his own room, he hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. Nothing. His room was exactly as he had left it. Feeling a mix of relief and foolishness, Ethan turned to leave. But then he heard it, a whisper, so faint he thought he might have imagined it. He spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. The whisper came again, louder this time, and distinctly coming from the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. Ethan's hands shook as he aimed the flashlight at the hatch. He had never been in the attic. It was a place his parents kept locked, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. But now, the hatch seemed to loom over him, a portal to the unknown. Summoning all his courage, Ethan reached up and pulled the cord. The hatch creaked open, and a rickety ladder descended. He climbed slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As his head breached the attic floor, he swept the flashlight around. The attic was filled with boxes and old furniture, covered in sheets and thick with dust. But then he saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the far corner, barely illuminated by the flashlight. "Who's there?" Ethan's voice trembled as he called out. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It stood unnaturally still, its features obscured by the darkness. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the air grew colder, and the whispering began again, surrounding him, filling his mind with disjointed words and chilling promises. Ethan scrambled down the ladder, his flashlight clattering to the floor. He ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. He reached the living room and grabbed the phone, dialing his parents' number with shaking fingers. The call went straight to voicemail. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the house. Ethan backed into a corner, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He could hear footsteps now, descending the stairs with deliberate, heavy thuds. In a last-ditch effort, Ethan dialed. The operator's voice was a distant comfort as he tried to explain what was happening. But the footsteps were closer now, and the whispering had become a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Their words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. "Please hurry," Ethan begged the operator, his voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. Ethan could see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its presence filling the room with a palpable dread. The lights flickered one last time and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Ethan felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and the whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all sound. Then a voice, clear and cold, whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't be here." The front door burst open, and a beam of light flooded the room. Ethan's parents rushed in, their faces pale with fear. The lights flickered back on, and the shadowy figure was gone. The house was silent again, but the air was thick with an unspoken menace. Ethan's parents held him tight, their relief palpable. They had received his message and raced home, fearing the worst. As they comforted him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, waiting. The police arrived shortly after, but their search of the house revealed nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being there. They chalked it up to a child's overactive imagination, fueled by a scary movie in an empty house. But Ethan knew better. He could still feel the cold hand on his shoulder, still hear the whispering in his mind. As he lay in bed that night, his parents close by, he listened to the house. It was quiet now, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the noises started again. And when they did, he wouldn't be alone. The house had its own inhabitants, unseen and unheard, waiting in the shadows. Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. The house had changed him, marked him. He was no longer the carefree boy he had been. Now he was a boy who knew the darkness, who had faced the unknown and come away with the knowledge that some things are better left undisturbed. In the silence of the night, the house creaked, and the shadows shifted. Ethan lay awake, listening, waiting, knowing that the whispers would return. And when they did, he would be ready, for he had learned that the real horror wasn't the unknown. It was knowing that it was always there, just out of sight, waiting. Jim stood on the sidewalk, looking up at his new apartment building. It was old and a bit run down, but it had a certain charm. The brick facade was covered in ivy, and the windows had ornate iron grills. It wasn't perfect, but it was affordable and close to his new job. He shrugged off the feeling of unease and pushed open the heavy front door, stepping into the dimly lit lobby. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s, and it showed. The floors creaked, the paint was peeling, and there was a musty smell that seemed to permeate everything. The landlord, a gruff old man named Mr. Harris, had warned him about the quirks of the place, but Jim didn't mind. He liked the idea of living somewhere with history. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment on the 3rd floor, he heard the muffled sounds of televisions and conversations from behind closed doors. His new neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving or nodding as he passed by. Jim unlocked the door to apartment 3B and stepped inside, setting down his boxes and taking a deep breath. "This is it," he said to himself. A new start. A few days later, Jim decided it was time to do some laundry. He gathered his clothes and headed down to the basement, following the directions Mr. Harris had given him. The basement was accessed through a heavy wooden door at the end of a long hallway. Jim pushed it open and descended the creaky stairs, the air growing colder and more stale with each step. The basement was even older and more decrepit than the rest of the building. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast eerie shadows. Jim found the laundry room tucked away in a corner, with 2 ancient-looking washers and dryers. As he loaded his clothes into the washing machine, he heard something. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft, eerie humming. Jim paused, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the basement. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. "It's just the pipes," he muttered to himself. "Old buildings make weird noises." But as he continued his laundry, the humming persisted. It was joined by other sounds, faint cries and whispers that seemed to echo through the dark corridors. Jim felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to ignore it. He finished his laundry as quickly as he could and hurried back upstairs, telling himself that it was just his imagination. Over the next few weeks, Jim settled into his new apartment. He met more of his neighbors, including Mrs. Harrison, a sweet elderly woman who lived next door, and Alex, a quiet man in his 30s who lived across the hall. Everyone seemed nice enough, but Jim couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept over him whenever he was in the building. The strange noises in the basement continued. Every time Jim went down to do his laundry, he heard the same eerie humming and cries. He asked a few of his neighbors about it, but they all shrugged it off. "Old building," Mrs. Harrison said with a smile. "It's bound to have some creaks and groans." Alex, however, seemed more reluctant to talk about it. "Just stay out of the basement at night," he said quietly. "You never know what you might hear." Jim laughed it off, but Alex's words stuck with him. He started avoiding the basement as much as possible, doing his laundry during the day when the noises seemed less intense. One night, Jim was woken by a loud crash from the apartment above him. He looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. Groaning, he got out of bed and went to investigate. He stepped into the hallway and saw Alex standing outside his door, looking up at the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" Jim asked. Alex nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. It sounded like it came from the old storage room." Jim frowned. He hadn't been aware there was a storage room upstairs. Together, they went up to the 4th floor and found the door to the storage room slightly ajar. Inside, it was dark and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. They didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. As they turned to leave, Jim heard it again, the faint humming and cries, this time coming from somewhere nearby. He looked at Alex, whose face had gone even paler. "We should go," Alex said urgently. "Now." Jim nodded, and they quickly made their way back to their respective apartments. But that night, Jim couldn't sleep. The noises were getting worse, and he was starting to think there might be something more to the old building's history. The next day, Jim decided to do some research. He went to the local library and looked up information on the apartment building. What he found was disturbing. The building had a dark history, with numerous reports of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances over the years. Tenants had complained of hearing voices, seeing apparitions, and feeling an oppressive presence. One story stood out to him, the tale of a woman named Emily who had lived in the building in the 1950s. She had reported hearing cries and humming from the basement, just like Jim. One day she disappeared without a trace, and her body was never found. The case had never been solved. Jim felt a chill run down his spine as he read the details. He couldn't help but think about the noises he had been hearing. Could Emily's spirit still be lingering in the building, trying to communicate? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Jim decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. That evening, armed with a flashlight, he went down the creaky stairs and into the dark, musty basement. The humming and cries were louder than ever, echoing through the corridors. He followed the sounds, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As he rounded a corner, he came across an old door he hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. Jim hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the boxes aside and opened the door. Inside was a small, windowless room. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Jim's flashlight illuminated the horror within. The room was filled with makeshift beds, shackles, and bloodstains. And in the corner, a stack of old, tattered clothes and personal items. Jim's heart pounded as he realized what he had stumbled upon. This wasn't the work of a ghost, it was something far more sinister. As he backed out of the room, he bumped into something solid. He turned and found himself face to face with Alex. "What are you doing here?" Alex asked, his voice cold and menacing. Jim tried to keep his voice steady. "I heard the noises again. I was just investigating." Alex's expression hardened. "You shouldn't have done, Tat." Before Jim could react, Alex lunged at him, knocking the flashlight out of his hand. They struggled in the darkness, Jim's mind racing with fear and adrenaline. Somehow, he managed to break free and ran back up the stairs, shouting for help. The police arrived quickly, and Jim led them to the basement. They found the hidden room and arrested Alex, who turned out to be a serial killer responsible for the disappearances of several tenants over the years. The noises Jim had heard were the cries and pleas of Alex's victims, their spirits trapped in the basement where they had suffered and died. Jim moved out of the apartment building the next day, shaken but grateful to be alive. The building was condemned and eventually torn down, its dark history finally coming to light. After getting out, Jim couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The experience haunted him, but it also gave him a new perspective on life. He moved to a new city and started over, but he never stopped thinking about the people who had suffered in that old apartment building. He knew he had been lucky to escape with his life, and though he still didn't believe in ghosts, he had learned that sometimes the real horrors in life were far worse than anything paranormal. And so, he made it his mission to remember the victims, to honor their memory, and to live his life to the fullest, never taking a single day for granted. Megan had been looking forward to her house-sitting job for weeks. The Jameson residence was a sprawling Victorian-style mansion on the outskirts of town, and she saw it as the perfect opportunity to enjoy some peace and quiet while earning extra money. The Jamesons were an elderly couple who spent most of the year traveling, leaving their grand old house in need of care. The first day passed uneventfully. Megan explored the rooms, marveling at the antique furniture and the intricate woodwork. She spent the evening reading in the cozy library. The only sounds the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional creak of the old house settling. As night fell, Megan made her way to the guest bedroom on the second floor. She settled into the four-poster bed, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the night. The house was quiet, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle rustling of leaves outside. Around midnight, Megan was jolted awake by a strange noise. She sat up, listening intently. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the attic above her. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, moving slowly across the attic floor. She told herself it was probably just a house settling, or a raccoon that had found its way inside. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and Megan lay back down, her heart still racing. She eventually drifted off to sleep, only to be awakened again a few hours later. This time, the sound was coming from the basement. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone was knocking on the pipes. Megan's skin prickled with unease. She had checked the basement earlier, and everything had seemed in order. Summoning her courage, she grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and made her way downstairs. The house was eerily silent, the only sound her own footsteps echoing in the hall. She descended the basement stairs, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom, and the thumping noise stopped abruptly. She swept the flashlight around the room, but everything appeared normal. The old boiler hummed quietly in the corner, and boxes of old belongings were stacked neatly against the walls. Megan's unease grew as she climbed back up the stairs. She decided to check the attic next, despite her growing sense of dread. She reached the second floor and hesitated at the attic door. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the cord, and the hatch creaked open. The ladder descended, and she climbed up, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The attic was filled with dusty old furniture and forgotten memories. The air was stale, and the beam of the flashlight revealed cobwebs hanging from the rafters. Megan moved cautiously, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The attic was empty. Relieved but still on edge, Megan made her way back to the guest bedroom. She climbed into bed, hoping to get some rest. As she was about to drift off, she heard it again, a soft melodic humming. It was faint, almost like a lullaby, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The humming grew louder, more distinct, and Megan felt a chill run down her spine. She got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the dark yard. That's when she saw it, a face, pale and ghostly, peeking in through the second-floor window. Megan stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The window was too high for anyone to reach from outside, yet the face remained, staring at her with hollow eyes. Terrified, Megan grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She tried to keep her voice steady as she explained the situation to the operator. Within minutes, she heard the wail of sirens approaching. She ran downstairs to unlock the door, relief flooding through her as she saw the flashing lights of the police car. 2 officers entered the house, their expressions serious. Megan led them upstairs, explaining the noises and the face at the window. They searched the house thoroughly, checking the attic, the basement, and every room in between. But they found nothing out of the ordinary. One of the officers, a tall man with a kind face, tried to reassure her. Old houses make a lot of strange noises, especially at night. And sometimes shadows can play tricks on your eyes. Megan nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The officers left, promising to keep an eye on the house, and Megan was alone again. She locked all the doors and windows, double-checking every lock. As she climbed back into bed, the house seemed to settle into an uneasy silence. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, she knew better. The humming started again, soft and melodic, wrapping around her like a sinister lullaby. Megan pulled the covers over her head, trying to block out the sound. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for sleep to take her. But sleep didn't come. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and Megan felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw the face again, pale and ghostly, hovering inches from her own. She screamed, the sound echoing through the house, but there was no one to hear. The face smiled, its hollow eyes filled with malice. The humming grew deafening, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. In the morning, the Jamesons returned to find the house eerily silent. Megan was nowhere to be found. The police were called again, and a thorough search was conducted, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The Jamesons never found another house sitter. The old mansion stood empty, its grand halls and forgotten memories cloaked in silence. And at night, if you listened closely, you could hear the soft, melodic humming, drifting through the empty rooms, a sinister lullaby that would never end. Lisa had always yearned for a life away from the relentless hustle of city living. The constant noise, the crowded streets, and the ceaseless pace had worn her down. When she stumbled upon a listing for a quaint Victorian house in a secluded rural area, it felt like fate. The house was old and needed some work, but its character and the promise of tranquility it offered were too enticing to pass up. The day of her move was filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The drive from the city was long, winding through dense forests and past sprawling farmlands. As she neared her destination, the landscape opened up to rolling hills and fields of golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze. The isolation was palpable, but it also brought a sense of peace she had longed for. Upon arrival, she was greeted by the sight of her new home. The Victorian house stood proudly on a slight hill, its weathered facade telling tales of a bygone era. The garden, overgrown and wild, added to its haunting beauty. Despite its dilapidated state, Lisa felt a strange connection to the house. It felt like home. Night 1. After a long day of unpacking and arranging her new space, Lisa was exhausted. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the landscape, she prepared for her first night in the house. The silence was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city, and it took some getting used to. She climbed into bed, the old frame creaking under her weight. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. As she drifted off to sleep, a sense of unease washed over her. In the dead of night, Lisa awoke with a start. A heavy feeling pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She tried to move, but her body was completely paralyzed. Panic set in as her eyes darted around the room, eventually landing on a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Its form was indistinct, its face obscured by darkness. In a raspy whisper it spoke, "Leave before it's too late." Lisa struggled to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis lifted, and the figure vanished. Gasping for air, she sat up, drenched in sweat. She tried to convince herself it was just a nightmare, but the sense of dread lingered. Night 2. The next day, Lisa went about her routine, trying to shake off the previous night's experience. She explored the house further, finding old photographs and letters tucked away in forgotten corners. The history of the house intrigued her, and she spent hours reading through the remnants of the past occupants' lives. As night fell, she felt a growing apprehension about going to bed. She finally succumbed to her fatigue and crawled under the covers, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. In the early hours of the morning, she was jolted awake by a cold breeze sweeping through the room. The window was closed, but the curtains billowed as if caught in a strong wind. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she saw a figure standing by the window, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed at her, its voice echoing in her mind. "You must leave." Frozen in place, Lisa could only watch as the figure slowly faded into the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, and it took hours for her to fall back asleep. Night 3. Lisa spent the day in a fog of exhaustion and fear. She confided in her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the area her whole life. Mrs. Thompson's face grew pale when Lisa described her experiences. She warned Lisa that the house had a dark history, with several previous occupants meeting untimely and mysterious deaths. Determined not to be scared off, Lisa resolved to stay. That night she armed herself with a flashlight and a prayer, hoping it would be enough to ward off whatever haunted the house. As she lay in bed, the silence seemed to press in on her from all sides. She drifted off, clutching the flashlight tightly. In the darkest hours of the night, she awoke to the sound of soft whispers echoing through the room. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices all saying the same thing. "Leave before the 6th day." Lisa fumbled for her flashlight, but it refused to turn on. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing inward. She screamed, and the whispers ceased abruptly. The room was silent once more, but the sense of impending doom remained. Night 4. The days were beginning to blur together. Lisa was exhausted, her nerves frayed. She had barely slept and her mind was plagued with the cryptic warnings and haunting visions. She tried to research the house's history, but the records were sparse and unhelpful. As night fell, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. She knew what awaited her, but felt powerless to stop it. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. They grew closer, stopping just outside her bedroom door. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stood in the doorway. This time it was a young woman, her face twisted in anguish. "You have to leave," she sobbed, "before the 6th day." Lisa's heart ached for the woman, but before she could say anything, the figure dissolved into mist. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. Lisa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep for the rest of the night. Night 5. By now, Lisa was a shell of her former self. She barely ate, and her eyes were hollow from lack of sleep. The cryptic messages were beginning to make sense, and a terrible realization dawned on her. She had only one more night to leave the house before the 6th day. Despite her fear, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something was holding her there, an invisible force she couldn't explain. As night fell, she prepared for what she knew would be the worst night yet. In the early hours, she woke to the feeling of cold hands wrapping around her wrists and ankles, pinning her to the bed. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Shadowy figures surrounded her, their faces contorted in silent screams. They pulled at her, dragging her toward the edge of the bed. "Leave now, or it will be too late," they chanted in unison. With a surge of adrenaline, Lisa broke free from their grasp, sitting up and gasping for breath. The figures melted into the darkness, but their message was clear. Night 6. Lisa knew she had to leave, but a strange calm had settled over her. She felt drawn to the house, as if it held some secret she was meant to uncover. She spent the day wandering through the rooms, feeling a deep sadness for the souls trapped within its walls. As night fell, she felt a strange sense of acceptance. She climbed into bed, her mind numb with exhaustion. She fell asleep almost immediately, the events of the past 5 days weighing heavily on her. In the darkest part of the night, she felt a presence in the room. She opened her eyes to see a figure standing over her, its face shrouded in darkness. "You were warned," it whispered, its voice cold and final. Lisa tried to scream, but her body was paralyzed. The figure leaned closer, its breath icy on her skin. "You did not leave. Now you will join us." Her vision blurred as darkness closed in around her. The last thing she heard was the chorus of voices, now clear and triumphant. "Welcome to the 6th day." In the morning, the house stood silent and empty once more. Lisa's belongings were untouched, but she was nowhere to be found. The locals whispered about the curse of the old Victorian house, and Mrs. Thompson sighed, adding Lisa's name to the list of those who had fallen victim to its dark history. Jerry boarded the cruise ship with a heavy heart, feeling a deep sense of loss and sorrow. The trip was meant to be a romantic getaway with his fiancée Emily, but a tragic accident had left him alone. Despite his grief, he decided to go on the trip, hoping the change of scenery might help him cope. His cabin was at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway on the lowest floor of the ship. It was small and isolated, a stark contrast to the bustling upper decks filled with laughter and music. He tried to immerse himself in the crew's activities, hoping to distract his mind. Day 1. On his first day, Jerry explored the ship. He marveled at the grandeur of the dining hall, enjoyed a swim in the pool, and even tried his luck at the casino. The buffet was a highlight, with a seemingly endless array of dishes. Jerry filled his plate with seafood, salads, and desserts, trying to savor the moment despite his loneliness. He chatted briefly with a few passengers, but mostly kept to himself, feeling like an outsider. As night fell, he returned to his cabin, hoping for a good night's rest. However, sleep eluded him. Around midnight, he heard faint crying outside his cabin. At first, he thought it might be another passenger, perhaps a child lost or distressed. As the minutes passed, the crying grew louder and more sorrowful, echoing through the narrow hallway. Jerry got up and opened his door, peering into the dark corridor. There was no one there. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of the ship's engines. He shrugged it off, convincing himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Day 2. The next day, Jerry participated in a cooking class and lounged by the pool, trying to soak in the sun and distract himself. He made small talk with other travelers, and even joined a group for a trivia game in the afternoon. The social activities provided a temporary escape, but the sense of unease from the previous night lingered. That evening, exhausted, he hoped for a peaceful night, but as he drifted off to sleep, he felt an intense pressure on his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His eyes darted around the room, and to his horror, he saw a dark figure standing beside his bed, staring down at him. The figure was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was terrifying. It loomed over him, faceless yet menacing. Jerry's heart pounded as he struggled against the paralysis. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure lifted, and the figure vanished. He lay in bed, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, the terror still fresh in his mind. Day 3. Determined to prove that he wasn't losing his mind, Jerry spent the next day exploring the ship, trying to keep himself occupied. He avoided his cabin until late at night, hoping exhaustion would help him sleep without incident. He joined a fitness class, played shuffleboard, and attended a wine-tasting event. But as the sun set, the sense of dread returned. As he was about to close the curtains, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A face was peeking in through the small porthole window. It was pale and contorted with rage, eyes glaring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jerry stumbled back, his heart racing. He realized with a jolt that it was impossible for someone to be outside the window. They were in the middle of the ocean. He closed the curtains quickly, trying to shake off the image, but the memory of that angry face haunted him throughout the night. Day 4. Jerry's sleep was fitful and filled with nightmares. He dreamt of the angry face from the window, of dark figures lurking in the corners of his cabin. When he awoke, he felt drained and uneasy. He tried to distract himself by joining in on some of the ship's activities, but his mind kept drifting back to the eerie events of the past few nights. He tried rock climbing, attended a dance class, and went to a comedy show, but nothing seemed to lift the growing sense of dread. That evening, he heard a commotion from the cabin next door. It sounded like a violent argument, a man yelling angrily and a woman sobbing. He pressed his ear to the wall, the sounds of abuse making his stomach churn. Unable to ignore it, he rushed out to find a crew member. When they finally arrived and checked the neighboring cabin, it was completely empty. The crew member looked at Jerry with concern, but there was nothing to explain what he had heard. Jerry returned to his room, more disturbed than ever. Day 5. On the 5th day, Jerry tried to drown his fears in alcohol at one of the ship's bars. He drank more than he intended, hoping it would help him sleep without interruption. He also tried to keep busy by participating in a mixology class and a talent show. He even tried his hand at karaoke, hoping the distraction would be enough to keep his mind off the eerie occurrences. That night, he decided to take a nap in the afternoon to catch up on the sleep he had lost. As soon as he lay down, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His body froze, and he found himself unable to move. He had experienced sleep paralysis before, but this time it was different. As he lay there, unable to move or cry out, he saw the door to the quarters slowly creak open. An eerie figure, a shadowy form, shuffled towards him. The figure's movements were unnatural, jerky, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The figure's eyes were hollow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Jerry wanted to scream, but he was trapped in his own body. The figure came closer and closer, its lifeless eyes staring into Jerry's. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very essence of fear was being poured into his soul. Just as the figure reached him, Jerry woke up, his body drenched in sweat. He looked around the empty room, his heart pounding. He knew it had been a dream, but it felt so real. That night, Jerry decided he couldn't take any more. He confronted a crew member, demanding to know what was going on. The crew member sighed and explained that the ship had a long history of unexplained occurrences. Many staff members had reported seeing apparitions, hearing voices, and feeling cold spots. "We've all learned to live with it," the crew member said. "But if it's too much for you, no one would blame you for leaving." Jerry shook his head. He wasn't a quitter. He decided to stick it out, determined to see his trip through. But the fear lingered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong on this ship. Day 6. On the 6th day, Jerry tried to keep himself busy and away from his cabin as much as possible. He joined a group for a shore excursion, exploring a nearby island. The fresh air and change of scenery were a welcome relief, but the eerie events on the ship weighed heavily on his mind. That evening, he heard a commotion from the cabin next door again. It sounded like a violent argument, a man yelling angrily and a woman sobbing. He pressed his ear to the wall, the sounds of abuse making his stomach churn. Unable to ignore it, he rushed out to find a crew member. When they finally arrived and checked the neighboring cabin, it was completely empty. The crew member looked at Jerry with concern, but there was nothing to explain what he had heard. Jerry returned to his room, more disturbed than ever. Day 7. Jerry's 7th night was the worst. He fell into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by the sensation of hands around his neck. He opened his eyes to find himself being strangled by an invisible force. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely breathe. His room was pitch dark, and the pressure on his throat was relentless. Desperate, he struggled against the force, but it only tightened its grip. Tears streamed down his face as he felt his strength waning. In a moment of despair, he whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over again. Finally, the pressure released, and he lay there sobbing, gasping for air. Morning came, and Jerry was eager to leave the ship. As he gathered his belongings, he tried to rationalize his experiences, but they left him deeply shaken. He stepped off the ship, his heart heavy with relief, only to be met by police officers waiting on the dock. They arrested him for the murder of his fiancée, Emily. The shock was overwhelming, and Jerry felt his world collapsing. He had tried to suppress the memory, but it all came flooding back. The guilt, the fear, the remorse. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The entity that had been haunting him was Emily, seeking justice for her untimely death. The eerie events on the ship were not mere coincidences or hallucinations, but manifestations of her restless spirit, consuming his conscience and forcing him to confront the truth. Jerry didn't resist. He confessed, his heart heavy with the weight of his actions. The haunting had been Emily's way of making sure he never forgot what he had done. As he was led away in handcuffs, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The terror was over, but the remorse would stay with him forever. For more eerie and scary stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for future updates.